Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. The Press Association is one of the few non-domestic news agencies and publishers with a correspondent in Wales, unlike The Guardian and The Times. That matters. Today we are going to speak with Bronwen Weatherby, who is the PA Wales Correspondent. We're going to look at the aftermath of the local election results and what it is like to report on Wales for a global news agency. Hello, Bronwen.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. So, Bronwen, could you start us off by telling us a little bit more about yourself and how you came to work for PA back in 2021?
Yes, so I've been a journalist for about just over 5 years now, which feels like a lifetime ago. I actually studied to become a journalist in Cardiff University and started my career in the Bristol Post, actually. Moved on to the Evening Standard, then to a sort of what you could easily call a left-wing independent newspaper in the Camden New Journal in London. And then I got a job as a PA reporter in London, and the Wales PA correspondent job came up, and I thought, wow, well, that's an opportunity to put my home country on a national platform and report nationally for Wales, really. So that's how that came about.
What are the kind of stories that you've covered during your time at PA, and where do they usually get picked up?
So I'm not going to lie, it's a lot of court. You know, there is a lot going on in the courts, and a lot since I started in September in this role, and over the lockdown, a lot of cases were delayed. So there's been definitely a backlog of quite serious cases. The Logan Muangi case, I don't know if you're familiar, being one of them. So it covered a lot of court. After the lockdown and during the lockdown, there's been an increased interest in politics in Wales, which for national newspapers is not something that's quite common. So I've tried to keep that going and keep the interest. And so I generally try and report when I can on the Senedd, any sort of press releases coming out, but also watching plenary, and then just everything in between. So, you know, it's a big patch. But for instance, today I was in Chepstow because a Ukrainian family were having the keys to their new home handed to them at a ceremony in a primary school there. You know, so it can be anything in between: court, politics, human interest stories. On a daily basis, anything that's the biggest news story in Wales, that's what I have to focus my attention on, because I am only one person, and I would say that unfortunately only one person covering Wales for the news agency.
So from your experience, what kind of knowledge do your colleagues have of Wales and what's happening here? And perhaps as a sort of secondary question to that, how would you find non-Welsh media sources' understanding of the Welsh political scene and news culture generally is?
Generally speaking, apart from obviously the regional journalists, most of the national journalists that cover Wales cover the Southwest and Wales. And generally the reporters live in the Southwest, and they're not Wales based. I think they do as good a job as they possibly can in covering such a large patch, but there are a lot of big things that go on in the Southwest as well. And kind of alluding to your second question there is definitely a bias in the national media towards news that happens, I'd say firstly around London, and then elsewhere in England. And, you know, Wales is often overlooked. So sometimes stories in Wales, they don't take precedent over the stories going on in the Southwest for those reporters. And that isn't necessarily their choice, but it is the way the news industry is currently.
Definitely. I think one of the things I'm interested in is, do you think that's changed or is changing? So do you think that perhaps the way that Wales has handled COVID is, you know, distinctly from the way it's been handled in England has given any impetus to news agencies based outside of Wales to cover Wales more thoroughly?
I'd like to think so. In terms of politics, I mean, I'd say that Mark Drakeford, for instance, given the character he is and has been portrayed in the media to be, that's definitely put more of a spotlight on Welsh politics. But I definitely say the appetite still isn't as much for Welsh politics or Welsh news as, for instance, Scottish news in comparison. The knowledge that national, reporters have that work the patch, is quite good, but often they do rely on my copy, my stories, for certain things because they're elsewhere doing stuff. So I definitely think there is perhaps a change, but there is a level of, and I hope this isn't too strong a word, but in certain national newsrooms, there is a level of kind of xenophobia still towards Wales and Welsh people. And, that's just the way it is. I'm hoping that's changing. And I really take it as part of my job, which is quite a hard thing to take on, but I really want to push news out of Wales and get them to pick it up. You asked earlier, sorry, I didn't really answer it, where the stories get picked up. I mean, all over, really. If it's a good story, you're talking the Mail Online, the Daily Mail, you're talking the Telegraph, the Times, the Guardian, as well as a lot of the Welsh newspapers and Wales Online. So, if there's a good story, then it will get picked up. Often, though, I think the stories have to be almost a higher caliber in Wales, coming from Wales, than they do elsewhere to get that kind of attention from the national newspapers.
So you mentioned Scotland there, and I think that's always been a bit of a fascination for me of why the coverage of Scottish news and politics is so much more in depth, or at least regular, than the Welsh equivalent. Is Scotland just a more interesting, exciting place than Wales, or is there just a weird sort of biases within London news agencies?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Obviously there's the independence question, which slightly rumbles in Wales, but hasn't really kicked out with a force, for people, all over the UK to really take it seriously. Whereas, there's been a referendum already in Scotland. So the chances of that. So I think there's definitely the sense that Scotland is other, and deserves that kind of coverage. Whereas Wales is often, kind of lumped in with England, as much as, people in Wales would rail against that. I think that has slightly changed, but there is, and I'm not even sure exactly why, but there is that disparity between how Scottish politics is covered and Welsh politics.
It's distance, Matt. It's distance. They've got that massive mileage between them and London and Fleet Street in the past. Bronwen, I'm gonna drag you into the topic the boys are very tired with, but the big recent story is the local elections, and you were on the ground reporting on the count from Swansea, I think.
Mm-hmm.
With a few weeks since we've had that the results now, have you got anything you can reflect on them?
I was in Swansea, so I was really focused there, and then I was being pulled on to reporting about it nationally as well. And the general picture was quite clear in Wales, I think. It was the gains that the Tories had made several years ago were being clawed back. And I don't think, when we're several weeks from that now, and I think when you look back, that's exactly what happened. Obviously, it's difficult to say it could be a precursor to national elections. But those who did turn up to vote in the local elections definitely made their feelings clear. The feeling and opinion towards the Conservative Party and the ruling power in Westminster has certainly changed. I actually spoke with David Davis today, the MP for Monmouthshire, and as we know, that was the Conservative government that. The Conservative council, they lost that council. It was the only one they held. And, I said to him, how do you feel about it? And he said, obviously disappointed. And I said, do you feel worried about, national elections and whether that translates into the national elections? And he said that he would never take an election for granted. But he admitted that there was, people had shown their disappointment and their frustration in the UK government. and basically that he would fight for the next election like he's fought for every election. But I imagine it does make him take pause. I mean, that loss wasn't just because it's no overall control in Monmouthshire now. It's not as if the Labour won it. However, they did get more seats than, so that was quite a significant loss. I mean, there was a huge loss in seats in that council. So I'm sure, he's taken pause, and, he did sort of give me the line that all the MPs were using, which is, the UK government is listening carefully now to the thoughts and frustrations of people around the country. But I mean, since then, the frustration seemed like it had hit, a heightened peak, during the local elections. But that has actually seemed to have grown, particularly with the conversation, the sort of growing conversation around the cost of living crisis. So I actually think that the local elections were in Wales were possibly definitely actually a precursor to national elections. It was a very interesting day, definitely.
I think Monmouthshire was something which has just come out recently, and that is interesting. And I was actually speaking to a newly elected cabinet member from Monmouthshire from the Labour ranks, and there was an indication that they may look at STV voting change in the next 5 years, which was interesting, and one I think we might look on in the pod. But you mentioned Mark Drakeford a little bit earlier, and you mentioned national issues. What extent do you think, Mark's position in Wales and reputation from COVID really came to the fore in the local elections?
I mean, obviously Labour did very well in the Senedd elections, didn't they? So perhaps there is a link there. When I talk to people about Mark Drakeford, they very much sit in two camps, and that's love him, and that's also, dislike him. So I don't think it's necessarily something, I don't think you could say that he is a leader that is loved across the country. But then when can you say that about a leader? But his popularity, his stance, I think, he really kind of put Wales on the map during COVID, and really kind of staked out what he wanted to do, what the Welsh government wanted to do, and how they wanted to do it differently from the UK government. And whether you agreed or disagreed with what he did, I think that shows some strength. And I think people are willing to get behind that, no matter how you vote. So I do think it will have had an impact. Like, ultimately, during the local elections, I got pamphlets through the door, I'm sure you did, from Conservatives, local Conservatives, saying, don't blame us for what's going on in Westminster. But ultimately, people are going to draw, from that, because they are connected, that you're part of the same party. And similarly with Mark Drakeford and the Labour Party, you can't separate them. So I think he's probably a very good leader for Labour, because he's really put Labour in the forefront of Welsh politics, and really on the map in politics in the UK generally. And I think people in Wales want Wales to be on the map. They want Wales to be counted when decisions are being made across the UK. And, he does that. I sound like a campaign manager for Mark Drakeford, don't I?
No, I think that was all fair comment, but I'm not sure whether you reported it, but I think we can all agree on this pod that the biggest story of the night was the green breakthrough across Wales, apart from in Cathays, Bronwen. But in reality, it was, as you just said, it was a good night for Welsh Labour. They reclaimed a lot of ground, and there's a few areas where there's a few hiccups, but Monmouthshire's a great story, for example. But I don't think it was such a good night in England for Labour, although they gained ground. It wasn't really brilliant. Do you think there's a real sense of a clear red water now emerging between UK Labour and Welsh Labour?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for sort of when Keir Starmer comes over and meets with Mark Drakeford. He's always going on about how popular Mark Drakeford is, and, how that's great to see. And I think Keir Starmer and the party in England definitely have a lot more of an uphill struggle than perhaps Labour in Wales. I mean, Wales is a very heavily Labour country. It always has been. Okay, they made some losses a few years ago, but those losses were perhaps easier to gain back. I don't, that is a completely different picture in England. I'm not sure, I'm not sort of an expert really on Labour in England, but I think, it's an uphill struggle. I think there's lots of reasons why they're gonna struggle to gain back even in the national elections, and not least because of the media landscape, should I say.
One of the big stories for me at the local election, I won't labour it, was the poor turnout. And you're reporting to an audience that really, I suppose, there's an awful lot of apathy there. What do you make of that apathy towards the local elections, or what stories do you think work well in Wales?
Yeah, I mean, the apathy is definitely disappointing. I mean, there's apathy across the UK, but I do sort of bang my head against a brick wall sometimes about the apathy in Wales, because this is where I'm from, and I wish people took more of an interest in their own area and how much their vote can actually affect things. I don't think necessarily that we don't exactly have, I'm not going to blame it all on the media, but we don't necessarily have a very healthy, well-rounded, but also, this is not, I'm not wording this very well, but we don't have a lot of media in comparison to England and in comparison to Scotland and even to Northern Ireland and Ireland. We don't have a very healthy media landscape. There is a lack of journalists here and a lack of journalism covering the length and breadth of Wales. There's only so many journalists, they can only do so much. And I think that has an impact as well, and a bigger impact than people know. And if they're not being galvanized, the issues that are underlying things aren't being investigated by journalists, they're not being reported, people aren't going to feel the need to start getting politically active. The other thing, of course, is that people aren't engaging in media in the same way either. And so there's an apathy towards the reporting that even is there. It is frustrating, because in Wales, I think there is an opportunity for people with their vote to make a difference, to get the kind of people and parties that they want into power. But apathy is a problem across the UK.
So I was going to go back to the Conservatives for a second. So obviously we're on today. They've had their Welsh conference in Newtown. You've seen Andrew R.T. Davies try to create this distinct Welsh identity, as was alluded to earlier. They had obviously a very bad night in those elections, but do you think that there is a need for parties in Wales to create distinct identities for themselves to be received by the Welsh electorate? Do you think they need to appear more Welsh?
Possibly. I mean, that's going to play differently with different parts of the electorate, isn't it? A lot of people perhaps, and I'm probably generalizing here, but there might be a lot of people who vote Conservative who like the British identity, and so connecting more with Westminster and the UK government is what they like. Obviously, there's another part of the electorate who would like the Tories to be the Welsh Tories, and to voice Welsh problems. I mean, I think it's good whenever politicians generally, and I mean individually, voice their own opinion as well as their parties. There's a lot of towing the party line, which I don't think is healthy. You can have different opinions, even if you have a generally, a political view like conservatism. And I don't think enough of that goes on anymore. So if Andrew R.T. Davies wants to differentiate himself and his Welsh Conservative Party away from the UK government, then yeah, if he legitimately thinks differently from them, then I think that's good. I think if it's an attempt just to win back support because it's, you know, there's been such bad headlines in regards to Boris Johnson and his cabinet and the government, then I think that's a bit cynical. But, you know, Wales is a different country and we do have different issues. We have similar issues to other parts of the UK, but we have different issues, and any party looking to represent Wales should stand up for that country. So I think that's fair enough.
One of the, you know, obviously, I'm sure you've seen the reports of reform that might be happening to the Senedd in time for the next election. One of the criticisms of that proposed system is it actually makes it much harder for politicians to have their own sort of individual view, because the system is so beholden to the power of the individual parties. Have you had much chance to sort of assess the proposed electoral system? And secondary to that, I suppose, is, do you think that even though to us in Wales that's quite a monumentous event, do you think that will even hit the radar of news agencies in London or Edinburgh?
So in answer to your first question, no, I haven't had a chance to properly sit down and assess it, only very briefly. Yes, I mean, I don't know a whole lot about it. I'm currently setting up some interviews to really kind of go into that with the different parties. But we've put out a brief story on it the other day when the Welsh government put out a press release about it. I mean, it was spoken of when they announced the cooperation deal with Plaid Cymru anyway. So it was reported in that sense, you know, a kind of line saying this is kind of what they're proposing. And then we've put out a story. But in answer to your second question, no, I don't think that will make much of a splash elsewhere, unless there's more of a sort of interesting detail to it, which is, I know it is interesting, but maybe it'll make more of an impact when and if it happens, because that, you know, sometimes when you're speaking about these kind of almost bureaucratic changes, you know, people elsewhere, they don't take note. But if it comes in, then Nationals actually might take, because there might be a bit of a reaction. I mean, there will be reaction from, you know, the Wales Secretary, perhaps from other departments in Westminster as well, you know. So sometimes it's a bit reliant on the powers that be in Westminster reacting to it for it to become a bit more of a big deal in the national sense. But we'll still report it, obviously. I was going to say, you know, I think, you know, PA Press Association, they used to have more reporters here. They had, I think it was 2 or 3, or maybe even more at one time. You know, they do only now have 1, but you're right in pointing out, you know, we're one of the only national news agencies and national newspapers that have a reporter solely based in Wales, covering Wales. I just want to go back to a question you asked me earlier, just because I remembered. You said, is that changing? And I said no, but there is, you know, obviously the BBC have local reporters in Wales. They've always had that. And ITV also have had reporters locally, and they had national reporters covering, again, like I said, Wales and the Southwest, a reporter. That has actually changed. ITV have now hired a separate correspondent just to cover Wales for ITN, so the national ITV. And that's a bit of a change because they're almost going more local. That's a decision in that organisation, that they feel like local news needs more coverage. And I think that's a good way to go, because national news is really important. But unless you know what's going on in your area, then you just don't understand why those national issues matter to you. So, I mean, you know, so I'm bigging up ITV there, but there is a slight change there, which I think is positive.
We're obviously a political focused and civic life pod, Bronwen. Does the stability of the political situation in Wales make it harder to find the stories that, you know, would be of interest elsewhere?
The stability of politics in Wales, as in, you know, it being kind of thoroughly Labour, do you mean?
as in we've had about 3 interesting political stories since 1999.
Yeah, it is tough going. And I have never, so I've specialized in a bunch of things, investigations and crime more specifically, and court. So politics is quite a new hat for me to kind of try and focus on. So it's something that I really want to really get more involved in. I've actually got an office in the Senedd, along with the BBC and ITV and Wales Online. But when I first started, there wasn't much point in going there because, you know, the Senedd members, they weren't back yet. Lots of people still are doing things via Zoom, which is great if that's how they're comfortable with. But I know they're coming back now in droves, I think. And sometimes that's where you find the stories, you know, in the hallways when you bump into someone and you have a quick chat with them. And you know, that is what goes on in the halls of Westminster. You know, my colleagues in the Press Association lobby team, you know, they're there every day and they're talking to people on the ground every single day. And so they do know the goings on. I think unless we're there, and I put a responsibility on myself in doing this as well, unless we're there and we're talking to people outside of plenary, outside of the meetings and outside of the press releases that we get, we are not going to find the good stories. We're not going to get behind the headlines that the Welsh government want you to see. I'm not saying that it has to be particularly salacious, but there needs to be more of that. And I put that responsibility on myself as well. And there definitely needs to be more interesting political stories coming from Wales. I'll try to bring you some of that, Kerry.
I'm sure some of us can feed in a few tidbits to you as well.
Oh, please. I'd always love a tip.
It's interesting you talk about, you know, salacious news and gossip. You know, so much of what we hear about Westminster politics is gossip, right? But that doesn't really happen in Cardiff Bay. Do you think that's just because Cardiff Bay is less full of gossip, or do you think that's because there's less appetite for that kind of news?
Absolutely not. I do not think it's less full of gossip. I think it's probably a hotbed of gossip. I think it's just sometimes a bit untapped. You know, like I said, you know, I started in September, so just after the lockdown, wasn't very many people when I went in, but I was told by, you know, someone who showed me around, you know, this place is buzzing, you know, on a daily basis when it's back to normal. And it is getting back to that kind of thing now, and which is why I'd like to sort of base myself down there a couple of days a week if possible. There are a few journalists who I know spend quite a bit of time down there, and you can always tell because their stories generally have a few quotes and things that you think they've actually spoken to the person, you know, they've like flagged them down or asked them to come to the office or gone to their office. And that's, you know, I think that's better reporting. You know, I think that's what it's an untapped gold mine. I think there needs to be more of that. I'm not necessarily saying the really salacious stuff that comes out of Westminster, you know, the really important stories as well. You know, you need to be on the ground talking to someone face to face, like a human being, to get them to open up to you about what they really think about things, because an email or a press release isn't going to do it. And, you know, press officers, obviously nothing against them, but, you know, they have a particular line that they're told that they need to tell, and it's usually quite sanitized. So I think it's quite untapped, actually, the Senedd.
I'm sure that the people and yourself, you know what the stories are that are going to be read, and you mentioned courts and crime and things like that. And is that one of the big drivers for the stories you get? Because, you know, there have been some pretty horrendous court cases of late in Wales, and I'm not saying that's why you're reporting them, but is that what, you know, gets the stories?
Often that's what gets picked up. Crime, no matter where it happens, does very well for newspapers. And, you know, with the invention of things like Chartbeat, where local newsrooms, national newsrooms can see how much stories are being read, that bornes out in the statistics. A crime story, of a horrific murder or something like that is going to do much, much better than a fairly dry politics story. And so that drives what your editors want you to do. And that's maybe sometimes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more crime you do, the more that's wanted because it does really well. And then you have less time to do the other stuff, which is often really important, but it just doesn't make as well, or it doesn't get you the hits. Court's also really important to cover. And there isn't anywhere near as many journalists as there used to be. When I was training, my editors would say, I remember when there was a journalist in every magistrate's courtroom, every Crown courtroom, which meant that often not only were crimes picked up, the kind of amusing crimes or the really bad ones, and the public were kept abreast of all that, but also wider issues in society were more easily noticed. And so you could, journalists could sort of have an understanding of what was maybe happening in a local area, and if there was an uptick of certain crime. That isn't there as much now. So, local newspapers and the nationals, they try and cover as much court as you can, because the whole point of that, other than it doing really well in your newspaper and your on your website, is that the public are generally at work when all this is going on. So journalists are their eyes and ears in a courtroom, and it's often really important. It's important for the public to see justice being done, and it's important, just to understand the kind of things that are going on, and perhaps injustices, perhaps awful things happening. It's where we often find out about failings by public bodies. So it is very important to cover. It just can take up a lot of time. So I follow court cases, and I dip into them then when it's coming to a head. And there's I'm looking at my diary now, and there's almost something every single day in Wales that warrants being reported, and I mean nationally as well. So and whether that's inquests or Crown Court cases. So I do have to, though, balance it with my editor doesn't actually want me in court every day, and he wants the politics stories and he wants the human interest stories. But yeah, generally that does take up a lot of my day, and it does take up a lot of resources for newsrooms, around the country.
Just, you mentioned something there, which in my amateur journalism position, can you just tell me what Chartbeat is, how that works?
So Chartbeat, I'm sure there are other versions, other companies that do this as well. I don't know their names if there are, but Chartbeat is a program in which you can tell how many people are on each story at any given moment in the day. So in newsrooms, and I mean that in every single newsroom, you'll have a large TV screen that has a list of the stories that are on your website, and it'll give you how many people are on them, how long they're engaging with the story for, and if people are also clicking from that story to another story in your website as well. So it's brilliant in some ways, but it has entirely changed newsrooms, because your companies that run the news in the UK and have lots of newsrooms like Reach PLC or NewsQuest, that's what drives money for them is viewership. So it becomes about what stories get the biggest clicks, the biggest views, and oftentimes those aren't what you would probably consider as like the important stories. Often they're things like weather stories or traffic news stories. They get huge viewership, and so it's more of that, please, and less of the other. And it's something that I think local journalists and elsewhere rail against a little bit.
Going back to that point, Bronwen, I think all of us in Wales are very used to articles about where the best Greggs in Cardiff or the best spoons in Cardiff is. So yeah, we know that feeling well. I wanted to move on a little bit to discussing another sort of audio news outlet. So you've been on Times Radio's Disunited Kingdom before.
Yes.
What would you say the challenges are for reporters sort of working outside London, trying to communicate things to London-based editors?
Well, generally speaking, for myself, I mean, obviously, PA have, you know, my line manager, I guess you'd call, so my editor, he is based in London, and, you know, but we chat every day, and they're interested in what comes from Wales because they have a reporter in Wales. Generally speaking, news from Wales doesn't take precedent most of the time. There are examples where that's not the case, but, you know, if it's happening in and around London or the wider southeast region, or even the rest of the UK, the rest of England, sorry, then that takes precedent, I think, for a lot of national newsrooms. They are still quite Anglo-centric. I don't know necessarily exactly what the reason for that is. I mean, naturally, obviously proximity helps, you know, people who generally work in national newsrooms that are based in London live in London or live around London. And so news in that region is going to matter more to them. But it is an ongoing struggle. You know, half of my job is thinking, how can I sell this to a national editor that sat there deciding what's going to go in his paper the next day? And that is an ongoing battle. I mean, I don't know what other reporters would say about it. I'm in a bit of a different situation because my news agency, you know, I need to, if I'm writing a story, it needs to be of national appeal. You know, it should be of regional appeal as well, if it's national appeal. But, you know, that's generally what they want from me is stuff that the nationals are going to go, oh yeah, that's a great story coming from Wales. And that's why I do like the fact that Times Radio does have pieces where they call in journalists from around the UK. I mean, that's something that I think should be done more. I think it would be worth as well, you know, radio stations, broadcasters in Wales, for instance, and in Scotland, having people speak from the rest of the UK as well, because it's important that we know what's going on in other parts, you know, not just either Wales or London, you know, as it often is. But yeah, I mean, that's why I like that show, really. And LBC can be quite good in getting lots of different contributors as well from around the UK.
So thinking about these pitches you're going to have to make of national importance, Bronwen, what are the sort of big stories that are on your radar looking forward through the rest of 2022?
The rest of 2022. The first thing that came to mind, but that's because I'm very excited about it. I don't want to jinx it, but if any of you are Wales football fans, I'm getting nods through Zoom there. I've been told that if Wales get through, touch wood, I'm going to Qatar. So that would be excellent because, you know, I'm going to Qatar. The second is, I think Wales football fans are a delight. and that's what I'll be doing. I won't be doing the sports reporting. I would not know what I was talking about, but I'd be more outside the stadium talking to fans and seeing how it's generally going, as I think there may be some teething problems with the World Cup this year. So things like that. But, you know, going back to what we were saying about court, you know, always on my radar, like big hearings, and the Logan Muangi sentencing is still to happen. And I believe the sentencing of two people, a man and woman, over, you know, the poor boy Jack Liss, who was mauled to death in Caerphilly. So there's things like that are, you know, they're big in Wales, but they're also big elsewhere. You know, they're really important, and people around the UK have really kind of shown an interest in those things. Politically, well, you know, I'm waiting for those tips to come in.
I mean, on the football aspect of it, yes, very excited for the game in a couple of weeks' time.
Yes.
So I'm very jealous of that prospect of seeing Wales in the World Cup. I just, you know, I think that sort of question we usually ask journalists when we finish off these interviews is, how would you consider the state of journalism in Wales? And do you think it is heading in a positive direction, or do you still think there's quite some way to go?
Do you ask every journalist this, or is it just me?
We ask basically every journalist this in some sort of hope that eventually people will say it's going really well.
Try and answer this in a considered way. I don't think it's necessarily going in completely positive direction. And I temper that with the amount of journalists, the amount of journalists and the amount of news outlets have dwindled significantly in Wales and around the UK. And, obviously as a journalist, I would say this, but I think that's very disappointing. And I think it has dire consequences for people. I mean, I would say though, that there are sort of smaller outlets opening around Wales that I think is a really positive sign. I can't name them all, but you have offshoots like the National and things like that, and I think that's exciting. And I think broadcasters as well, like ITV, recognizing that you need more of a focus on Wales. It needs its own correspondent. I think that's positive. I'm trying to be positive for you here, Matt. But generally, the landscape, it doesn't look great. Media companies have been struggling with with the question of how you make money from journalism for decades now, and changes that perhaps should have been made earlier were not made, and sort of now news is free, and people have grown up, including myself, not paying for news, and so it's really hard to roll back on that and start asking people for money, because people are like, oh, I'm not paying a subscription, and a newspaper, I'm not paying for a newspaper, I'm not paying for a hard copy of something. So, and newspapers are still what make companies money, believe it or not, even though sales have completely fallen off a cliff. That is still what makes them money, but just less and less every year. I don't know if there's any that buck the trend of that. But that's a problem, because companies feel like they have less money. They still need to make money for their shareholders and things like that. So they have less money to put into resources, and that means journalists. And it ultimately means like the type of content that you get isn't as good, because they're chasing their tails as well. They're trying to get the hits that companies constantly want. More hits, you need to get more page views every year than you had the last year, but with less resources. So you do the math. There's only one way that you can do that, and that's not going out as much, and that's being at your desk, kind of turning around fast hit kind of popular news stories that people will click on because they want to know something specific about the weather quickly, and then they'll click off. And I've got lots of friends who work in lots of different regional papers around Wales, and for some it's a massive source of frustration. For others, that's just that they're doing their job, and that is what the company requires of them. So I think there's a problem with the whole system, and it comes back down to money, as it always does. But I would like to say that there's a positive outlook with, and I'd hope there's more sort of newsletters, more kind of hyper locals coming. That's certainly very popular. Like when I was living in London, that's very popular there. I think it would be really great if there were more sort of grants and funding for independent papers to spring up. I think that would be really healthy for the media landscape in Wales. I mean, if there's any sort of millionaires listening out there who live in Wales that want to kind of open up a pot, I mean, there are some pots, but they're quite few and far between, and they're quite difficult to access. I think there's a lot of journalists out there who'd sort of jump at the opportunity to create an independent paper in a part of Wales where there's no newspaper really covering it. Wales is, if you look at a map of where there are newspapers, where there are online websites, quite a bit of a news desert. So there's opportunity to improve. I don't know if that's a good way to end it.
That's fine. And if there's any millionaires listening, they can please back the Hiraeth Patreon, as well as all other good news outlets in Wales. Bronwen, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you this evening. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find you on Twitter?
They can find me at Bronwen Weatherby. My email is on that Twitter. So if anyone wants to send me a story idea, a tip, or generally chat about something they've got going on in Wales that they think is of national interest, then please do. I'm always happy to chat.
Great. Thanks again, Bronwen.
Thank you so much.
And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find us on Facebook and Twitter at Hiraeth Pod, and on our brand new website, www.walespolitics.com. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.